So welcome to the Positive Psychology Center's Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is James Powelski. I'm Director of Education and Senior Scholar at the Positive Psychology Center. Positive psychology is the scientific study of what makes individuals and communities thrive. While much of mainstream psychology has focused in the last 50 years, quite rightly, on psychopathology and its treatment, positive psychology seeks to balance psychological study by focusing also on what goes well with people. The Positive Psychology Center was founded in 2003 and is the leading center in the world for research, teaching, application, and dissemination of positive psychology. The Positive Psychology Center's Distinguished Speaker Series explores connections between the humanities and the social sciences and human flourishing. Last month, we welcomed Julian Mark, a philosopher, who talked to us on the topic of what does it mean to flourish. Next week, we will have another speaker with us, Karen Armstrong, who is a New York Times best-selling author and TED Prize winner. She will give us a talk on the topic compassion, nice idea or urgent global imperative. That talk will be next Thursday, 5:30 to 7 o'clock p.m. at the Annenberg Center's Zellerbach Theater. More information is in the handout that you received as you entered the room. And now to today's talk. We are very pleased to have with us Josh Greene. Josh is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Harvard University and the Director of the Moral Cognition Lab there. He studies moral judgment and decision-making from neuroscientific and behavioral methodological perspectives. Since he has a PhD in philosophy, his approach is guided largely by questions that are traditionally considered to be philosophical. So he fits right into the theme of our speakers series. Now, before I turn it over to Josh, I just want to mention that in the best tradition of scientific studies on human flourishing, the Positive Psychology organizes a happy hour every Thursday. And so for those of you, Josh is going to be there with us today after the talk. So if you want to talk more with him after his presentation, you're welcome to join us there. We meet at Mid-Atlantic, which is at 38th and Market Street. So we'll be there right after the talk. And now, without further ado, to talk to us about beyond point and shoot morality, here's Josh Greene.
Well, first, I just wanted to say what a great honor it is to be here. I'm not used to having my name and distinguished in the same sentence, so it really is an incredible honor, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and people who've been great inspiration to me as I've moved through this field, or the fields, I guess, that I've worked in. So thanks so much for having me and for taking the time to listen. What I'm going to do today is the talk I'm going to give is going to be part philosophy and part psychology. And as a scientist, my job is just to describe how the mind works and not necessarily make any bold recommendations about how we ought to think, just to tell us how we do think. But I'm going to let my philosopher side out a little bit and try to put the philosophy and the science together. And try to say something about what kinds of moral decision-making might make it more likely for us to flourish as a society in dealing with the kinds of peculiarly modern moral problems that we today face that our hunter-gatherer ancestors may not have faced. So the central metaphor for the talk here is this idea of the design of a camera and how that design is mirrored in the design of the human mind, and how that design is reflected in the tension between competing moral philosophies. So as I said, both in philosophy and in psychological science, we tend to think of there as being a bright line between the pristine world of ought and the messy world of the psychological is. And I actually think that that's more or less right, that there really is a sharp and important distinction between describing how things are and prescribing for how things ought to be. Nevertheless, I'm going to try to convince you that that understanding the messy world of the moral is, can give us important guidance when we think about the questions about how things ought to be. And the key bridge between the two realms is moral intuition. So moral intuition is a natural psychological phenomenon. It's something that we can study empirically. And at the same time, we rely on our moral intuitions to tell us what's right or wrong, what we ought to do. And the hope is that by understanding the psychology of moral intuition and moral psychology more generally, even if that doesn't give us all the answers, it can give us important guidance as we're making decisions about what we think is right or wrong for ourselves and as a society. So that's the fundamental problem, bridging the psychological is and the moral ought. So the plan for the talk is I'm going to first describe to you the theory that I've been developing over the last 10 years or so, which for lack of a better name we'll call the dual process theory of moral judgment. And I'll lay out the basic idea, the initial impetus for it, some familiar evidence for it, if those of you at least who are familiar with my work, and then I'll talk about some new evidence that provides additional support and additional nuance. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about this question of what exactly it is that sets off our emotional alarm bells or fails to set off our emotional alarm bells. So this is kind of an important piece within the larger dual process framework. And then I'm going to try to get back to some of these ethical normative issues and see if we can get any mileage out of the science that we've done. Okay, so dual process. So some of you may recognize these two people here. This is John Stuart Mill, who is one of the founding fathers of the utilitarian or consequentialist tradition in ethics. And basically what Mill says is that in the end, what's right or what's wrong is ultimately a function of consequences. And that what we ought to be doing, at least at the highest level, if not with every little decision we make, is trying to produce as many good consequences as possible and minimize bad consequences. It's basically cost-benefit analysis applied impartially to the world as a whole. That right and wrong is ultimately about the consequences that follow from our actions. Over here we have Immanuel Kant, who is the patron saint of a different school of moral thought, sometimes known as deontology, which conceives of right and wrong not primarily in terms of costs and benefits, but in terms of certain lines that must be crossed or must not be crossed. And the most common way to talk about this is in terms of rights or in terms of duties. And sometimes doing your duty is not necessarily what's going to produce the best consequences. Sometimes respecting people's rights is not necessarily what's going to produce the best consequences. But according to Kant and other people who agree with him, nevertheless, that's what morality demands of us. And what I'm going to try to convince you of, at least part way, is that these two competing moral philosophies are actually grounded in dissociable systems in the brain. That this philosophical tension is actually just the philosophical tip of a much deeper psychological and even neuroscientific iceberg. And so I'll show you some evidence for that. And so for the first part, what we're doing is using these philosophical concepts to carve up the moral brain at its joints. And then at the end of the talk, I'm going to try to then take what we've learned from that scientific expedition and apply it back to the philosophical issues, the philosophical tension that is described in that framework. Okay. So before I talk about anything having to do with morality, I'd like to talk about the general design of complex systems, starting with the camera that I had on that very first slide. So this is the camera that I got for my birthday a few years ago, and it's a nice camera. It's good for an amateur like me because it has these nice, handy automatic settings. So if I want to take a picture of someone up close in indoor lighting, you put it in portrait mode, and it automatically adjusts the f-stop and everything else, and it will allow you to take a pretty good picture. If you want to take a picture of a mountain from far away in broad daylight, well, you put it in this landscape mode, and it will adjust things a little bit differently, and it will give you probably what you want for taking that kind of picture. Point and shoot. Now, on rare occasions, I get ambitious, and I want to try to do something fancy with the camera. Maybe have my subject out of focus and off to the side with a long exposure. Who knows what I might dream of. And if I'm going to do something fancy, Then you put the camera in manual mode. When you put the camera in manual mode, you can adjust all of the settings yourself, and you can get exactly what you want, tailored to your specific, perhaps idiosyncratic photographic ambitions. And the nice thing about having this design with these automatic point-and-shoot settings and manual mode is that it allows me or any other camera user to navigate the perennial trade-off between efficiency and flexibility. So the automatic settings are very efficient, point-and-shoot, but they're not very flexible. They're really just good for what they're designed for and not much else. In contrast, the manual mode is maximally flexible. But it's not very efficient in the sense that it takes a little time. You have to know what you're doing. You can make a mistake. And the nice thing about having the camera that has both is that if you know how to toggle back and forth between manual mode and the automatic settings, then you can have the best of both worlds. You can have point and shoot when that's all that the situation demands. But when you're in another situation that requires a bit more flexibility, then you can use the manual mode. And I think, and a lot of other people think, that the human brain is essentially designed along the same principles. So let me give you an example of this. So this is in the context of the perennial problem of delaying gratification. And so with apologies to Joe Cable, who I don't know if he's here, but he doesn't necessarily agree with this, this is the dual process story of delay of gratification. So you've put people in a situation where you can have $2 now, let's say, or $4 next week. And in general, when you present somebody with a situation in which they can have an immediate reward, you see parts of the brain that are very sensitive to reward being preferentially engaged. So this is the ventral striatum, which is a sort of central brain region for tracking the value of rewards, and then the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which receives signals from the ventral striatum and integrates them into decisions. An oversimplified story, no doubt, but I think true enough for our purposes. And you can think of this response to immediate rewards as being like this. I could have $2 right now. Great, gimme, gimme, gimme. And this can be for money or food or sex or whatever it is that makes you say, yes, great, now, thank you. Now, that's not all of human life. We can look at that immediate reward and say, well, that's very nice, and I kind of would like that. But if I wait another week, I'll get something that's significantly better, and therefore it's worth waiting. So I should say this gimme gimme now response is essentially an automatic setting. It's in general, these are things that are good for us to have, money, food, etc. And if they're available, well, why not go for it? And so that's sort of the default automatic response. But we also have another response, as I started to say, which is that we can look at this and say, well, I'd like to have the $2 right now, but if I wait a week, I can have twice as much. And doesn't that make more sense in this situation? And when people are presented with opportunities for delayed rewards, you see increased activity in a set of brain regions that it comprises what we'd call the control network. This includes the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and corresponding regions in the parietal lobe. And you see more activity in these brain regions, particularly the DLPFC, when people choose a greater delayed reward over an immediate reward. And so what this system is good for is taking the path of greater resistance, saying, I'm not going to take this immediate thing that's available now. Instead, I'm going to hold out for something that in this particular context is available and is better. So just the point is that the automatic settings that say grab it when the getting's good, that's very efficient, but not very flexible, whereas you're using your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and your prefrontal cortex more generally, you can assess what's available in the particular situation and decide what makes sense overall in the long term given your goals. Another example of this is in the assessment of people who come our way. An unfortunate fact about human brains is that they react in negative ways often to members of racial outgroups. So this is data from a study by Will Cunningham and colleagues from 2004, following on an earlier study by the same group, showing that when you present white, at least I think mostly college students, with pictures of faces of black men, you get this acute response in the amygdala, which, again, oversimplifying a bit, is a part of the brain that you can think of as a kind of early warning alarm system, that it says, hey, there's something important here, possibly dangerous, possibly negative, you need to orient your attention to this. And this particular result here, this comes from presenting these faces subliminally. So the people are not aware of what they're seeing, but a subliminal presentation, too quick to see, produces this response. If you present the faces superliminally, so that they're on the screen long enough that you can actually be aware of what you're seeing, then you see increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and reduced activity in the amygdala. So this is, for better or worse, an automatic response that perhaps in some environments, maybe not ours, I would hope not ours, it would be adaptive, but then we're able to say, no, but that response is really not appropriate in this case. There's nothing to be worried about here. So automatic and controlled responses at sometimes together, but in these interesting cases at odds. So I want to put that in the background, this idea that in general, we have automatic responses that, at least in some contexts, may be adaptive and in a very efficient way, but we also have this capacity for flexible, situation-specific thinking. Now, on to morality and a set of moral dilemmas that have occupied me now for the last 15 years, and apologies to those of you who have heard this before, but I don't want to assume that everyone has. So this set of dilemmas is collectively known as the trolley problem. Philosophers were arguing about this long before I came along. And the first one, which we'll call the switch case, goes like this. This trolley is about to run over these 5 people, and you can save them by hitting a switch that will turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto the 1. And if you ask people, is it okay to hit the switch to minimize the number of deaths, most people say yes, that's okay. And this fits very well with John Stuart Mill's utilitarian philosophy. That is, go with the numbers, produce better, do whatever's going to produce the best consequences. Better to have more people alive than dead. And that's fine. Now, a different version of this case, known as the footbridge dilemma, goes like this. The trolley is headed towards these 5 people, and now the only way to save them is to push this big guy off of the footbridge, so he'll land on the tracks, and he'll get squashed by the train, he'll die, but it'll prevent the trolley from killing these 5 people. And here, I won't make you do a poll, most people say that it's not okay to push the guy off the footbridge. And this reaction that people have fits much better with a Kantian point of view. That is to say, yes, you may be able to save more lives by doing this, but it would be wrong. This man has rights, and you can't just use him as a trolley stopper. You have a duty to respect these rights. And so there's an interesting question, which is, well, so philosophers have looked at these cases and said, assuming that we're right, that it's okay to trade 1 life for 5 here, but not here, what is the reason? What are the principles? There's a psychological question here as well, and this is the question that really got my research going, which is, what is it about this case here that makes us say that it's wrong to push the guy off the footbridge, but what is it about this case that makes us say that it's okay? And so that's the empirical question that we're starting with, and I'll tell you the answer. One thing I want to say up front is a lot of you may be thinking, can you really stop a footbridge with a guy? And why can't you jump yourself? Why are you pushing this guy instead of you? I can show you data related to this, but just trust me, people will still say that it's wrong, even if you make it very clear that you know this will work, and we can set it up so that you can't jump yourself, you're not big enough to stop the trolley, etc. I'm pretty confident that that's not what's going on here, so don't get too hung up on that. One other caveat before we move along. Are there any philosophers here? Anyone from the philosophy department? A couple of people. I am going to be using the terms deontological and utilitarian in a somewhat non-standard way. For philosophers, a judgment is deontological depending on the reasons behind it. Whereas I'm saying, I'm basically describing a judgment as deontological if it's naturally justified in deontological terms and not in utilitarian terms. So when you say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge, it's very clear that you're going with the numbers. And when you say that it's not, that's naturally justified in terms of you have no right to do that, or you have a duty to respect other people's rights. And so I just want to be clear that I'm not necessarily using these terms in the way that philosophers would approve of. I'm borrowing on credit the idea that this is okay, and I hope to pay that back by explaining why, if the theory turns out to be right, that actually the philosophies are the tips of these deeper psychological icebergs, then these names will in fact be apt. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. This is Kant's grave in Königsberg, and this is the direction of rotation as I describe these judgments as duty-based, etc., without any specific evidence for this. So I just wanted to flag that issue. Okay, so I'm just going to give you the very simplest version of the dual process story. Not because, and I'll tell you some things later that will add some complexity, but I want to make sure the basic idea gets on the table. So the idea is that you get a case like the switch case, and there's one part of your brain, one system in your brain that looks at this and says, well, 5 lives for 1, that sounds like a pretty good deal. And then there's another system in your brain that looks at this and could have more of an emotional response, but doesn't respond very strongly to the idea of running this person over in this case. And so you might feel a little uneasy about this, but not too much. And so most people end up saying yes. Yes, it's okay to hit the switch. In the footbridge case, same system as above, looks at this and says 5 lives for 1. That sounds like a good deal. But the other more emotional system reacts more strongly in this case. And as a result, most people say no, it's not okay to push the guy off the footbridge. This is the idea at its most basic. As I said, we'll be adding more nuance. So what I want to do now is first present some evidence for this pathway here, that something about the footbridge case is triggering an emotional response that is making people say, no, it's wrong to push the guy off the footbridge. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly review a whole bunch of evidence that's already out there in the literature, and then I'll focus in on some more specific things. So the first experiment that I and my colleagues did now, published coming up on 10 years, the basic idea was, well, let's have people in the brain scanner. We give them the switch case and the footbridge case. And the prediction is that when they respond to the footbridge case, you're going to see more emotion-related activity. And when people are responding to cases like the switch case, it's going to look something more like reasoning. The experiment couldn't quite be that simple because you can't just give people 2 dilemmas in a brain scanner and compare them. You have to do these things over and over and over again. And that required us to define a class of dilemmas that were like the footbridge case and a class of dilemmas that were like the switch case. And we didn't actually know exactly how to do that, so we took a guess that we knew that was wrong. We called these things personal and impersonal. And I'm not going to say anything more about this study because even though this is the study that's the best known, I think it's actually, of all the stuff I'm going to tell you about, it might be the weakest evidence for the theory at this point. But the basic idea is that indeed when people were responding to these cases like the footbridge case, you saw increased activity in parts of the brain that are associated with emotion and social cognition more broadly. And I just want to draw your attention to 2 areas that will come up again and again. One is the medial prefrontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that was damaged in the case of Phineas Gage. So people familiar with Phineas Gage? Yes. So this was the 19th century railroad foreman who was this wonderfully upstanding guy. He got an iron spike through his medial prefrontal cortex. And although his quote-unquote cognitive faculties remained intact, he could do math, his language was not impaired, and so on and so forth, his decision-making and moral character were dramatically disrupted. So this is one of the regions, or the main region, that was damaged in that case. And then on the other side, for cases like the switch case, you see activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the same part of the brain that's saying, wouldn't you rather wait a week for $4? Or saying, there's nothing to fear here, that's just the picture of a nice guy on the screen. So consistent with the dual process theory, but a long way from overwhelming evidence. I think probably the strongest evidence comes from studies of patients with emotion-related brain damage. And there have now been several studies of patients like this using these kinds of moral dilemmas. And in a second, I'm going to focus in on one that had particularly dramatic results. Studies of psychopaths show that when psychopaths respond specifically to these sorts of cases, they exhibit decreased activity in the amygdala, the part of the brain, again, that is responding negatively to faces of those outgroup members, at least when they're presented subliminally. Other groups have done work with psychophysiology. People are essentially getting sweatier palms when they're looking at these kinds of cases. A recent study basically gave people SSRIs, so like Prozac, citalopram, the actual drug, which makes people acutely more emotionally reactive. And the people who were given the citalopram were, as a result, less utilitarian. They would say, no, it's wrong to push the guy off the footbridge, which is consistent with this story. Positive mood induction, the idea is that if it's a negative emotional response that makes people say, no, don't push the guy off the footbridge, what happens if you hit people with a dose of positive emotion? And so in this study, they had people watch a film clip from Saturday Night Live. This is Chris Farley being silly. And the people who watched Farley were about 3 times as likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. And now you may wonder, is this a Farley-specific effect? You might think maybe he looks like a good trolley stopper. Actually, other people have followed this up, and it seems like it's actually specific to humor, but not specific to Farley. But in any case, there's an emotional channel here that can be manipulated to affect the judgment. And finally, individual differences in judgment style. So people who report relying more on intuition and less on reasoning and reflection in their general decision style are more likely to say that it's wrong to push the guy off the footbridge. So there's a lot of evidence, I think, supporting this, and a lot of convergent evidence from different methods. I want to focus on a couple of things. So this is, I think, the strongest single study. This was by Carnegie and colleagues studying the famous Iowa ventromedial prefrontal patients. These are the patients characterized and described in Damasio's book, Descartes' Error. So just to walk you through this, these are different moral dilemmas here. The ones to the right of the bar are the ones that are like the footbridge case, where there's a utilitarian reason for killing somebody, doing something horrible in the name of the greater good. This is the proportion of utilitarian judgments that people make. The white dots are normal, healthy controls. The gray dots are people with other kinds of brain damage. And then the black dots, which hover well above, are the patients with the ventromedial prefrontal damage, the Phineas gauge damage that disrupts emotional contributions to decision making. And you don't really need statistics to analyze these data. These patients are on average about 5 times more likely to give utilitarian responses to dilemmas like this. That is to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge in the name of the greater good. So disrupting that emotional channel makes people default to that cold cost-benefit analysis, the kind favored by John Stuart Mill, at least at the highest level. And this is where a map of the overlap of the damage in these patients. So now I want to tell you about a new study, this is not yet published, done with graduate student Amitai Shenhav, that's trying to break down these decision processes into different subcomponents. So the idea is that on the one hand, people get a case like this, and they have a kind of immediate emotional response that makes them say, no, not okay to push people off footbridges. And they've got that utilitarian calculation. And then these two things are somehow integrated to produce an all things considered judgment. And in almost all the studies, I think all the studies that I described to you, people are being asked for an all things considered judgment. In this study, we're trying to break it down by asking people to do different things. So in some cases, we ask people which action will produce better results. And the idea here is just to focus on the utilitarian calculation. In other conditions, we ask people, just tell us which you feel worse about doing. Don't tell us what's right or wrong, all things considered. Just tell how bad does this feel? And then finally, the all things considered judgment. Which of these two alternatives is more morally acceptable? So first, what happens when we compare the all things considered judgment to the other two, where we're asking people to just focus on one side of this dual process story? What we see is increased activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex for the all things considered judgment. So this is a new wrinkle, a new nuance in the dual process story. The way I told you originally is that it's emotion on one side and reason on the other. It's actually a bit more complicated than that, at least in the normal case. That is, what seems like is going on here is that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is, again, as I said, a region that's responsible for having emotional responses bear on decisions, is actually, in an affective way, taking into account the emotional response and the utilitarian calculation and integrating them into an all things considered judgment. And this is actually consistent with a lot of recent research in neuroeconomics. That is, brain imaging studies of people making economic decisions in which they have to take into account different dimensions of the decision. So there's a kind of tension here, actually, between this result and something I said earlier. If this brain region is just integrating these two signals, then if it were damaged, you might think that the patients would just be random, that they've got one response and another competing response, but the integrator isn't there, and so who knows how it's going to turn out. But in fact, the patients, as I said before, who have damage to this region become much more utilitarian. So what this tells me is that actually the utilitarian calculation can get out into behavior in two ways. One is by competing for affective dominance with the automatic response. But if the emotional integrator is taken out of commission, then it can also get out straight into behavior. And that seems to be what's happening in those patients who have damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, what about the emotional assessment? If you look where in the brain, what in the brain is tracking the feeling of badness? So this is when we ask people, just tell me, how bad do you feel about this? The amygdala, which I mentioned before now twice, once in the context of looking at racial outgroups, and then again showing decreased activity in psychopaths responding to these dilemmas. Here too, we see increased activity the worse the action is reported to be feeling. And then if we look in the specific brain region, the specific part of the amygdala that's showing this effect, and then look at that when people are making their all things considered judgments, the level of amygdala activity predicts, in a loose statistical sense, the judgment. That is, people, the more amygdala activity, the less likely people are to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. So this is consistent with the idea that this immediate emotional response is indirectly driving the behavior and pushing it in the less deontological, less utilitarian, more deontological direction. So I mentioned an earlier study, actually done here by Andrea Glenn. I don't know if Andrea is here. Is Andrea? Anyway, I mentioned an earlier study done by Andrea Glenn and Adrian Rain, showing that you see decreased amygdala activity in people actually more with psychopathic tendencies. I believe this was a community sample when they're responding to these dilemmas. This is a similar study done with Kent Keel at the University of New Mexico. These are actually incarcerated psychopaths, so these are real hardcore. And we also found that on both sides they have reduced amygdala activity when they're responding to these kinds of dilemmas. And furthermore, found something that Glenn and colleagues didn't find, which was that there actually was a correlation between their behavior and their level of psychopathy. So what this is, on the y-axis here, we have the level of psychopathy, and particularly the subscale of the psychopathy scale that measures the affective component. Basically, how much of a cold-blooded killer are you, or not necessarily killer, but lack of empathy for other people, lack of concern for others. That's what we're trying to predict, and we're predicting it on the basis of two things: the decisions people make and their reaction times. And the idea is that while ordinary people will sometimes often say, yeah, it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge, they're reluctant to do it. Whereas the signature of the psychopath is the person who says, kill one to save five? Okay, that sounds reasonable. Doesn't have a sort of a kind of emotional voice saying, what are you, crazy, pushing people off of footbridges? So there, in fact, is this, you can actually detect it in their behavior if you use a combination of reaction time and judgment. Okay, so this is also new, not yet published research done with postdoc Eleanor Amit, who was interested in the roles of visual thinking and verbal thinking in judgment and decision making in general. And here we're applying this to moral decision making. So we talked about having this emotional response that makes you go, don't push the guy off the footbridge. But what are you actually responding to? I think there's a natural sort of theory that says, well, maybe what's going on, tell me if this is consistent with your experience, you're actually envisioning something like this footbridge scenario. You have a little movie in your mind, so to speak, and that you're actually responding. Obviously, there's no footbridge event in front of you right here in Steitler Hall, so you have this, you're imagining this scenario in a sort of vivid sensory kind of way, and then your emotional response is actually to that. And this is actually consistent with the functional neuroanatomy associated with responding to these things. For those of you who follow this literature, you get increased activity in what's known as the default network, which is a set of brain regions that seems to be active in general when people are envisioning narrative episodes, either from the past or from the future, or thinking about the contents of somebody else's mind. Anything that's not here and now, that takes a kind of episodic form. And so this made us think, well, okay, so maybe it's this image, and perhaps visual imagery in particular, that's setting off the alarm bells and leading people to say no. So what Eleanor did is she said, well, so we might see this in individual differences. So she devised a working memory task, actually based on a task originally used by your own Sharon Thompson-Schill, where you had either, the memory task was either using shapes, so like squares and triangles and circles, or words corresponding to features of shapes, so the colors. And so one is pictorial, one is done with pictures, and the other is done with words. And you give people the same working memory task, the same memory test, either the visual form or the verbal form. And then you just give, everybody gets 2 scores and you subtract them. And so for anyone you can say, how relatively visual are they versus verbal based on this test? And the hypothesis is that the people who are more visual, who do better on the visual version of the task, are going to be less utilitarian. The verbal ones are going to be more utilitarian, and that's what we found. So if the more you are tilted in the visual direction, the less utilitarian you are, or the more verbal, the more utilitarian you are. So this is consistent with the idea that it's actually visual imagery that's setting off the emotional response. Now this is just correlational. So we wanted to do an experiment where we actually interfered with people's visual and verbal thinking. And so we had people make these judgments while they were either doing a concurrent visual task or doing a concurrent verbal task. And the hypothesis is that, at least one side of it is that messing with people's visual imagery by making them remember shapes while they are doing the moral judgment will make them more utilitarian. That is, if you need the visual image to set off the emotional response that makes you say no, and you disrupt that visual image by having them do this other visual task at the same time, then people will become more utilitarian. And that's indeed what we found. So the visual version, people gave higher moral acceptability ratings to things like pushing the guy off the footbridge. So this is a no task control, and then this is the verbal version of it. Okay, so I showed you a bunch of evidence showing that there seems to be an emotional response pushing people to say no. What about evidence for this controlled cognition here? And again, you can think of this as like automatic settings. Now we want to look at the operation of the manual mode. There's now a lot of brain imaging evidence showing that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is preferentially associated with utilitarian judgment. So you give people these dilemmas where you can kill one person to save 5, and overwhelmingly we see, not always in exactly the same place, increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex when people make the utilitarian judgments. And again, this is the part of the brain that's responsible that enables you to say, I'm going to wait a week for the larger reward, or no, that person's not really a threat to me. And we see this sort of in the most simple case where you're just doing footbridge. Here in this experiment, it's like the switch case. You can turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto the 1, but now you've promised this one guy that he wouldn't be run over, and you have to break your promise if you want to save more lives. And when people say, break your promise to save more lives, you see more DLPFC. In this case, it's, what if you flip it around? Is it okay to turn the trolley away from 1 and onto 5? And you say, no, that's stupid. That doesn't add up. Why would you do that? And when people give this kind of utilitarian disapproval, you see increased activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. I mentioned the study before where we looked at the utilitarian calculation versus the emotional reaction, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex as well, and then in another experiment that's too complicated to explain, and in fact another one that I didn't even put up. So lots of DLPFC for utilitarian judgment over and over again. We have a study where we show that putting people under cognitive load facilitates utilitarian judgment. And then, again, other results with individual differences. So this is people who say they really like to think about things more and not go with their guts. They are more likely to give utilitarian responses. So I'm going to now show you a couple of more recent studies that unpack the manual mode in moral judgment, the utilitarian judgments in a bit more detail and provide some more support. So this is a study done by postdoc Fiery Cushman and Dylan Murray, who's now a philosophy graduate student at UC Berkeley, using a cognitive depletion paradigm that are pioneered by Roy Baumeister and colleagues. And this actually uses something that I'm sure will be familiar to many of you called the Stroop task. How many of you are familiar with the Stroop task? How many of you have not heard of the Stroop task? Any Stroop virgins? Okay. Well, since there are a few, we'll all Stroop together. So in the Stroop task, your job is to name, in this version of it, your job is to name the colors in which the words are printed. So here's the word bird in blue. You shout out the word bird. You shout out the word, sorry, incongruent. You shout out the word blue. I just illustrated my point. Shout out the word blue, and we'll all do this together. Don't be shy, even if you've done it before. You should do it every few years just to keep up your Stroop. Ready? Here we go. Yellow, come on.
Red, blue, green, yellow, blue.
Right, so it never fails. So you get these incongruent trials here where your automatic response is to say yellow because you read words all the time, but your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is saying, no, dummy, we're doing color naming. Name the color, don't read the word, you idiot. So what we did was we just basically wore people out by giving them lots and lots of stroop, and then gave them these dilemmas. And as predicted, when you stroop people out, specifically for these cases like the footbridge case, you get, now on this one, unfortunately, the y-axis is reversed. You get less utilitarian judgment, more deontological judgment when people are depleted, when they've been worn out with the stroop task. So you wear people out, and then they're less likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge, more likely to say that it's wrong. So just a behavioral demonstration of the dual process idea. And the idea that there are domain general cognitive resources that are enabling you to say, well, maybe you should push the guy, you can save more lives. Now, this is kind of born of an ongoing debate with my esteemed colleague John Haidt, who said that he thinks that moral judgment is driven almost entirely by intuitions. And when he thinks of reasoning and reflection, what he thinks of that as being is something like, you have competing intuitions, and you sit back and you mull them over and you feel them both, and then at some point one feels more prominent than the other, and that's your decision. And what Joe Paxton, graduate student, and Leo Unger, who's now a med student, wanted to do is say, well, can we show that utilitarian judgment is not just differently intuitive, but that it's really counterintuitive? It's not just two different competing intuitions, perhaps of different strengths. One is really the counterintuitive answer. So how do you do that? So they're using something called the cognitive reflection test, which is basically a set of little math problems. And the critical ones are these tricky little items where, well, you'll see it like this. So a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, most people's first thought is 10 cents. And that's wrong. The right answer is 5 cents. 5 cents and $1.05 add up to $1.10. You subtract them, they're $1. But most people's first thought is wrong. Some people just go with their first thought and they get it wrong. Other people, they have that first thought, but then they think, well, let me check the math there. And then when you check the math, you get it right. And so there are three different items that have this intuitively wrong, but if you think about it, you can get it right property. And what Joe did was gave people this cognitive reflection test before having them respond to moral dilemmas. And the idea is that if you get at least one of these right, you have the experience of going, aha, I better not trust my intuitions all the time. My intuitions can be wrong. And that the idea is that this is a generic prime of counterintuitiveness. Don't trust your intuitions. And the prediction is that if you make people distrust their intuitions in a general way, they will become more utilitarian. But you'd only make that prediction if you don't think it's just intuition versus intuition, that one is the intuitive answer and the other is the counterintuitive answer. And that is, I wouldn't be telling you this if we didn't find the results. That's what we found, that giving people the cognitive reflection test first, if they got at least one right, makes them more utilitarian. And the more items they get correct, the more utilitarian they are. Now, you might be wondering, are we inducing people to be more utilitarian? Or is it just that the kind of people who get these problems right are also more likely to be utilitarian? And the answer seems to be that it's actually a little bit of both, in case you're wondering. And this is not an effective mood, in case you're wondering. OK, so another experiment of Joe's, kind of following on kind of this ongoing debate with John Haidt. For a long time, moral reasoning was at the center of moral psychology. And in fact, at Harvard, where I teach for a long time, there was the moral reasoning requirement. Reasoning is what morality is all about. Haidt came along and said, Patui, I don't buy this. It's actually intuitions that are driving the judgments, and that reasoning is really primarily used for rationalization. And maybe reasoning in this sense of mulling and influencing each other by offering what we might call reasons, but real hardcore reasoning, that may not happen very much at all, maybe in the philosophy department. And the sort of classic illustration of this phenomenon is the story of Julian Mark. So this is not necessarily for the faint of heart. So Julian Mark are brother and sister who are traveling on vacation, and they say, gosh, wouldn't it be nice if we had sex? And they have sex, and they think it's fine. Haidt asks people, so is this okay? And they say, no, of course not. And then they say, why not? And they say, well, they'll have kids with birth defects. And then Haidt says, you didn't read the story carefully enough. They've used 8 kinds of birth control. And they say, so now do you think it's wrong? And they say, I still think it's wrong. Why? And they say, oh, they'll do terrible psychological damage to themselves. And Haidt says, oh, you didn't read the story carefully enough. Everything was fine, and they kind of knew it would be fine. At least that's how he spins it. And people stick to their guns on this. And so this is the kind of classic illustration that when you've got an intuition, the reasoning just follows to justify it, but you can't really argue people out of at least certain intuitions. And basically what Joe wanted to do is say, can I talk people out of their Mark and Julie intuitions? Can I get people to reason their way out of this? This, by the way, this is not Mark and Julie, they're fictional. This is Danielle and Nick, who are a half-brother and sister in England, who were separated as children and then fell in love, and their mother caught them, and it was a nasty mess, and there are people trying to pull them apart, but they want to be together. This is a real-life Mark and Julie, sort of. So can you get people to change their minds? And so the idea was to try to give people a good argument for thinking, well, maybe certain cases, brother-sister incest, not so terrible. And so this is the strong argument that Joe and I constructed. You may not think this is a strong argument, but wait till you see the weak argument. So it says, for most of our evolutionary history, there were no effective contraceptives, and so if siblings slept together, they might conceive a child. Children born of such closely related parents would have a lower than normal likelihood of surviving. Thus, the feeling of disgust towards incest probably evolved to prevent such children from being born. But in Julian Mark's case, 2 kinds of contraception were used, so there was no chance of conceiving a child. The evolutionary reason for the feeling of disgust is therefore not present in Julian Mark's case. Any disgust that one feels in response to Julian Mark's case cannot be sufficient justification for judging their behavior to be morally wrong. So it's basically an evolutionary debunking argument, saying, yes, you have these icky feelings, but this is based on evolutionary considerations that really don't apply here. Get over it. And that's, I would say, at least a relatively strong argument relative to this. So this is basically saying, why shouldn't they make love? There needs to be more love in the world. If they make love, there'll be more love in the world. The brothers and sisters love each other. Love, love, love. And so this is the weak argument. And then we gave people the strong argument and the weak argument under 2 different conditions. We either asked them to respond immediately, or we gave them a delay. And the idea is that the signature of reasoning is going to be that there's an interaction between the strength of the argument and the amount of time to think about it. If people just take a long time, well, it could be that one intuition just kind of tends to win out over the other when you mull, right? But if that winning out is sensitive to the quality of the argument, well, then you have an extended process that takes some time. It's not just having an intuition. And it's sensitive to the quality of the argument. That sounds a lot like reasoning. And so the results really sort of were in line with the predictions, even better than we expected, mostly because of this. When people were asked to respond to this immediately, the strong argument versus the weak argument, how acceptable is what Mark and Julie did, there was no difference, which kind of is a little scary. That like immediately people really can't tell the difference between a good argument and a bad argument. But if you give them a couple of minutes to think about it, just 2 minutes, then you get this divergence. The bad argument starts to seem worse, and the good argument starts to seem better. So this, I think, is really the strongest evidence yet that people can actually engage in moral reasoning, and this kind of poetic justice is sort of using this case that was famously used to illustrate the idea that people, once they have a certain kind of intuition, you can't talk them out of it. So reasoning and not just cognitive control in moral judgment. Now, I've talked about all of the moral psychology I've talked about so far, with the exception of the incest thing, has been using these trolley dilemmas. And I've argued that it's an emotional response that's behind the thought of rights or duty, and then it's this controlled reasoning cognition on the side of the utilitarian judgment. And this slide is just to say this happens more broadly. If you look, for example, at disapproval of what you might call harmless transgressions, so things like you promised your grandmother that you'd visit her grave, and then you get really busy and you don't really want to do it. It's going to be, cause a lot of problems for you to have to go make this trip. No one else will know. Is it okay to do that? It's emotions that are telling you you must visit your grandmother. This is Jonathan Haidt's actually dissertation. When it comes to retribution and punishment, so punishing not for the purpose of deterring future crime or preventing future crime, but simply to give people what they deserve the way Kant wanted them to, you see more emotions behind that. Kant once wrote that if there was an island community, they had to abandon their home quickly because of some emergency. On their way out, they should kill the guilty prisoner so that you can get a little extra retribution in before you go. So this is a very much a Kantian kind of idea. And then finally, obligations to help people. And I'm going to show you a study about this a little bit later on. Okay. So one thing you might be wondering is, trolley schmollies, does this have to do with anything in the real world? I've heard this before. The reason why philosophers started talking about these things is because they seem like nice little fruit fly test cases for this ubiquitous moral problem of the rights of the individual versus the greater good. But not everybody can see that world in these grains of sand. And so I wanted to do an experiment, do some work to show that this stuff actually applies in the wider world. This is sort of justifying my presence here today. So this is work done with Katie Ranselhoff, who just turned in her thesis. That was the basis for this work. And then with Dan Wickler, who's a philosopher and ethicist at the Harvard School of Public Health. And the basic idea was we wanted to come up with more relatively realistic medical dilemmas that have this same footbridge-like quality, the rights of the individual versus the greater good. And so what we, meaning mostly Katie, came up with are cases where, for example, you're rationing drugs or equipment or organs, taking it away from this person because you can do more good elsewhere, quarantining an infectious patient for the good of other patients who might be infected, using resources for cheap prevention instead of expensive treatment for one person. And all of these cases, the idea is that there's the rights of the individual versus the greater good. And so we gave people these dilemmas, and we also gave them our old trolley cases. And the idea is that if it's the same underlying psychological process at work in these more realistic applied ethics problems, then we should see a correlation in people's responses to both. And that's indeed what we saw. So first, just the pilot study for this was just ordinary people, and as predicted, the more people give utilitarian responses to trolley sorts of cases, the more people give utilitarian responses to these more realistic medical dilemmas. So this is a nice, I think, demonstration that the psychology at work in trolley cases applies more widely. And then, this was the main purpose of the experiment, we said, okay, well, can we see this out in the real world? And the hypothesis, so we wanted to give both sets of dilemmas to doctors and to people in public health. And the idea is that if you're a doctor, you're focused on the rights, your duty to that patient, the rights of that patient. It's the one patient who's in front of you. Do no harm, right, says the Hippocratic Oath. Whereas if you're in public health, your patient is the society as a whole. Your concern is for the greater good. And so the hypothesis is that the people in public health are going to be more utilitarian, and the people the doctors are going, the MDs are going to be less utilitarian or more deontological. And that's exactly what we found. So this is utilitarian judgments. This is for the medical cases. This is for the non-medical cases. And in both cases, the people in public health were more utilitarian than the doctors. So what this tells me is that there really is something going on in the real world, that people end up in the medical profession or in public health and thinking the way they think, not because of some answer they gave to a trolley problem. There's either some kind of self-selection going on in the real world, or there's some kind of professional training going on in the real world. But either way, it's something in the real world that's making doctors and people in public health respond differently, not only to our little toy trolley cases, but to the real kinds of cases that doctors and people in public health have to deal with. So this gives me some this bolsters my original thought that this stuff might not just be toy dilemmas, that it actually tells you something about the real world. This is getting at this more specific question of what is it that pushes your moral buttons? What sets off your emotional responses? Another way of putting this is, to what are our automatic settings sensitive? To go back to the camera analogy. So this is just using these simple little questionnaires where you give people a diagram of, say, the switch case. The trolley's headed towards these 5 people. You can hit the switch, turn the trolley away from the 5 and onto the 1. Most people say this is okay, so this is just the original switch case. You give people the footbridge case. Now it's a guy with a big backpack. You can push him off the footbridge. He lands on there, stops the trolley, saves the 5. Most people say that that's not okay. Our question is, what is it about this case that makes people say that it's wrong? And so we can play around with the cases. This is low tech, no brain imaging or anything like that. And I should say, in the interest of time, I'll say we've controlled for people's real world expectations in a statistical way, and I can give you more information about this. So we start with the footbridge case. Let's look at this idea of sort of distance, up close and personal. So instead of pushing the guy off the footbridge, now our friend here can hit a switch that will drop the guy through a trap door, and he'll land on the tracks and get squashed by the train and save the 5. Here, about 30% of people say it's okay to use the guy as a trolley stopper. In this other case, if you give a different group of subjects the same, this version, the number doubles to about 60%. So it seems to have something to do with distance. But is it really about distance? Well, here you're pushing the guy, you're also close to the guy. Here you're not pushing, you're also far away. So is it about distance or is it about contact? Well, let's put the switch right next to the guy. It turns out that not much difference whether you are next to the guy or far away. So it's not actually about distance, it's actually more about touching. But is it really about touching? Here you are pushing the guy, you're touching the guy, but you're also using your muscles to directly influence the person, to directly impact the person. Whereas here you're not touching and you're also not doing that. And we can separate these two things looking at what I call personal force. So here we have the footbridge pole case where you push the guy off the footbridge with a pole. So now you're not touching the guy, but you're using your personal force to directly impact him. And this goes the way of regular pushing. So it's not about touching per se. It's something about having your muscles directly impacting the person. Okay, so another classic moral dilemma. This one originally comes from the philosopher Peter Singer. This version is sort of updated by a philosopher named Peter Unger. In this case, you're driving along by the side of the road, and this guy says, please help me. I had an accident while hiking. I'm bleeding heavily. I know something about medicine, and there's a hospital down the road. If you don't get me to this hospital, I'm probably going to lose my leg. It'll probably have to be amputated, but if you could take me there, that would be wonderful. Can you please take me? And you say, well, I really would like to help this guy, but I just had this new leather upholstery put in my car. He's going to bleed all over the place. It's going to cost me at least, I don't know, $500. I'll leave him. Maybe somebody else will take him. How many of you think it would be morally monstrous to leave the guy bleeding by the side of the road? I see most of your hands going up. Okay, next case. You're home one day, and you get a letter in the mail that says, please send us $200, $500, whatever it is. We are UNICEF, Oxfam, World Help. There are people on the other side of the world who are badly in need of food and medicine. A relatively modest donation from you could save these people, at least one person's life, maybe several people's lives. Would you send us some money? And you say, well, I'd like to help these people, but I've been thinking of having some new leather upholstery put in my car. And so I think I'll save my money for that, and maybe someone else will donate. Now, how many of you think you're a moral monster if you spend money on luxuries for yourself when you could use that money to save the lives of people on the other side of the world? Couple people. And how many people actually live by that? No hands, right? So there's a big difference in how we react to this person in dire need and this person in dire need. Now you might be saying to yourself, oh, when you give money to charity, it just goes to corrupt dictators. You're kidding yourself. It's not true. You really do have the power to save someone's life. It's a comfortable fiction. We can talk about that more later if you want. So another wonderful undergraduate named Jay Musin wanted to kind of do the trolleyology of this helping dilemma. And so we tried to construct cases where a lot of the things that you might think would be really morally important are controlled for. For example, you might say that when the guy's bleeding by the side of the road, you're the only one who can really help there, whereas the people on the other side of the world, well, lots of people can help, and maybe that changes your moral obligation or something like that. So we tried to do this in a more controlled way. So in one version, this is a big study with a gazillion different conditions, but I'll just show you, I think, the main punchline. In one version, you're traveling abroad, visiting a poor but lovely country where you're vacationing, and you just get there, and there's this typhoon that's hit, and there are people who are in desperate need of food and medicine, and you can help. The way they actually like you to help, there's already a relief effort underway, but they're badly in need of resources. You can make a financial donation on the spot that will help them take care of these people. Must you make a donation to these people who are there where you're visiting? 68% of the people in our sample say that you should be doing something while you're there. In the other version, everything's exactly the same, except you're not over there. You have a friend who's over there, and your friend has a smartphone, and you have your computer, and your friend is showing you everything that's going on. So you can see everything that your friend sees, and you're in just as much of a position to help. You can make a donation online just as much as they can make a donation where they are. You have all the same information. You're in just as good a position to help. Your information is completely reliable. You can see everything with your own eyes, and your friend is right there who you trust. Do you have a moral obligation to help? In this case, about half as many people say that you do. So just mere spatial distance, just the fact that you are physically far away makes you say, we have to help here. Most people say this, whereas most people say you don't here. Okay. So I promised, even though I'm kind of running out of time, that I would say, well, what is this? Does this tell us anything about what's right or what's wrong? And I noticed this group and other groups, when I present to you the pushing with the full or with the distance thing with the smartphone, you kind of go oof or chuckle a little bit. That's a normative chuckle. That is a chuckle that's saying something is out of whack with our minds. And the rest of the next 10 minutes I want to spend trying to spell out exactly what that means for us social philosophers. So again, the challenge here is to bridge the psychological is and the abstract moral ought. So if you ask me to summarize why does science matter for ethics, this is how I'd put it. Science can advance ethics by revealing the hidden inner workings of our moral judgments, especially the ones we make intuitively. Once those inner workings are revealed, we may have less confidence in those judgments, as well as ethical theories that are explicitly or implicitly based on them. And I think there are two routes to moral significance. The one is kind of the direct consequence of what I called the normative chuckle. And then the other is a more indirect route that sort of brings us back to the camera analogy. So let's talk about the chuckle. I want to give you another example from another domain. So here's a difficult ought question. Do capital juries make good judgments? Well, hard to answer that. How would you answer that? This is kind of a value judgment. It's a complicated situation. Here's a bit of scientific a very unfortunate bit. Juries are sensitive to race. And in fact, they're sensitive to, in some ways, degrees of race. So someone who has more stereotypically African-American features or African features is more likely to get the death penalty than someone who doesn't if the victim is white. This is not the main thing I want to talk about. This is sad but true. But in any case, let's assume this is a scientifically demonstrated fact. Well, this doesn't tell us, this doesn't by itself answer our question. We have to ask ourselves, ought capital juries be sensitive to race? But that's a pretty easy question, at least for the people in this room. We'd say, no, they ought not. And once we're willing to make that value judgment, now we can get a new answer to our original difficult question. Capital juries often do not make good judgments. And the idea here is that the science doesn't answer the question by itself. What the science does is allows us to trade in a more difficult ought question for an easier ought question. The value judgments never drop out of the picture. It's not that science replaces value-laden ethical questions. It's just that it provides information that allows us to leverage some values against other values. And we can make a similar case about the case of Mark and Julie, which is interesting because there you wouldn't be tempted to say that it's just an application of values we already have. There's actually a change of mind about one's values. But I'll leave that for question period if you want. So now what are we doing here? So do people make good moral judgments when confronted with moral dilemmas, whether you're a amateur trolleyologist or you're a doctor or a person in public health deciding how to allocate medical resources? Now here's a bit of scientific is. People's moral judgments are sometimes sensitive to things like mere personal force, pushing versus dropping with a switch, or mere spatial distance. How far away are the victims from me, even when everything's the same in terms of my ability to help and what I know about what's going on. And then we can ask ourselves, ought people's judgments be sensitive to things like personal force and mere spatial distance? And I think most of us, our chuckle, our gasp, says no. There's something kind of funny about saying that it's wrong to push somebody off a footbridge with your hands, but it's okay to drop them with a switch. There's something strange about that. And if that's right, then we can say, well, sometimes at least people do not make good moral judgments when confronted with moral dilemmas, particularly when they're affected by stuff like this. So again, science doesn't answer the moral question. You don't get, the ought doesn't imply, the is doesn't imply the ought, but the is can inform the relations among our oughts and lead us to new oughts. Now what about the indirect route? Why does it matter So if the dual process theory is true, why does it matter if some of our judgments are driven by what I've called automatic settings, automatic emotional responses, and others are driven by manual mode, by more flexible, conscious reasoning? Well, one thing you might want to know is, are our automatic settings reliable? And the wonderful power of automatic settings has been described in a very lively way in Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, basically sort of touting the wonderful benefits of thinking without thinking. And as Gladwell himself acknowledges, blinking can be good, but it can also have its problems. So here is one of his examples of when it's good, is you have the art expert who can immediately just look at a statue and tell whether or not it's a forgery. Well, that's super. But you also end up with people like Warren Harding as president, who's really not a very good president, and no reason to think he would be, but he looked so gosh darn presidential, people voted for him anyway. And then, of course, there's the tragic case of Amadou Diallo, who the police who fired upon him, their instincts said that this guy was a threat, when in fact he wasn't at all. So the answer, I don't want to rely too much on Gladwell, but the research does back this up, is that it depends. Sometimes our automatic responses are good and sometimes they're not. Well, when are they good and when are they not? I'd make the following argument, that automatic settings work best when the situation is familiar in a technical sense. That is, when they embody the lessons of trial and error experience with similar situations. So how do you get trial and error experience into your intuitions? Well, one possibility is genetically. That is, ancestors who had certain experiences, some of them had certain traits, and the ones who didn't have those traits died, and we inherit their genes and have certain automatic emotional responses. So a plausible, if not by any means demonstrated example of an evolutionarily entrained automatic response is the fear response to enlarged eye whites. Maybe that's an example, maybe it's not. Supply your own if you can think of a better one, let me know. Cultural experience. So how many of you have had a run-in with the KKK? None of you. I promise you that when you see this picture, your amygdala goes whoop, like that, or you have some kind of negative emotional response to this. It's not because of some kind of reward or punishment regimen that you've experienced. It's based on cultural learning. And then finally, there's your own experience. If every time you see a blue square, you got an electric shock, you would have a negative emotional response to blue squares. As far as I know, these are the only processes that can manufacture functionally complex automatic responses. It's got to be the trial and error experience of your ancestors, the trial and error experience of your culture mates, so to speak, your cultural ancestors, or your own trial and error experience. Those are the only three ways that automatic responses can get smart, right? Now, there are some instances in which we can't rely on our automatic settings because they don't have the right kind of trial and error experience. So think of learning to drive. It's not an innate skill. Our ancestors did not have cars. Cultural familiarity is not enough, even if 15-year-olds think that they can watch a bunch of movies and watch people drive and then get behind the wheel and drive instantly. You can't do that. And you can't rely on your personal experience because that's exactly what you don't have when you're a new driver. The only way to learn how to drive is using your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in manual mode. You have to consciously think about what you're doing, resist the urges to do the wrong things, and then eventually it can get automatized. It would be a cognitive miracle if you could just get behind the wheel of a car for the first time and drive fluidly like a pro. And likewise, I would claim it would be a cognitive miracle if our moral instincts are completely reliable. So let me flesh that out. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this Kant stuff. Basically, what I think is going on in a lot of philosophy is, and in particular in someone like Kant, is he's basically saying, the automatic settings are right, and I can prove it. I can give you a rational demonstration that these are our rights, these are our duties. On the other side, you have people like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham saying, I don't trust those instincts. I think that we should think about morality in terms of cost-benefit analysis. And I think that this is a problem, well, that as philosophers, both professional philosophers and lay sort of social philosophers, we may be too quick to think that our intuitions may be rationally justifiable, which is what I think that Kant and others are largely doing. And I apologize for skipping over that, but I'm already way over time. The question I think we should be asking ourselves is this. Should we be relying on our automatic settings when we're dealing with problems like this? How do we respond to a terrorist attack from people on the other side of the world? How do we decide whether it's okay to bomb civilians in war, or whether we have an obligation to help distant strangers on the other side of the world, or what counts as a fair proposal for distributing the burdens of preventing global warming, I would submit that these are likely to be problems where our automatic settings are not up to the task, that it's like driving a car, that your intuitions have not had the right kind of trial and error. Take, for example, dealing with global warming. We're still on our first trial. So there's no way that anyone could have trial and error experience with this in forming their intuitions about what's fair and what's not. This especially comes up in bioethics. Should we have an opt-out versus an opt-in organ donation program? A lot of people feel like having an opt-out system, this is one where you have to say, I don't want to participate, otherwise you're in, that this is a violation of people's rights, but it could save thousands of lives every year if people were willing to do this. But people's intuitions tell them that it's wrong. Stem cell research, people in persistent vegetative states, the list goes on and on. In a lot of these cases, I think we have intuitions that are getting in the way of the greater good. And maybe those intuitions are onto something. Maybe they're onto some abstract moral truth, but maybe they're just holdovers from other contexts, contexts in which our intuitions were honed, but not honed by the features of the situation that are present now. So to summarize, our brains have efficient automatic settings. That is, we have emotional moral intuitions. And these may serve us very well most of the time. Our brains also have a flexible manual mode, a capacity for moral reasoning. And these may be best brought out only in certain rare cases, perhaps in the public policy domain and not in the domain of living our personal lives. But I think our challenge as moral citizens is to learn when to point and shoot and when to put ourselves in manual mode. When are we likely to be making good decisions based on instinct, and when do we really need to put our intuitions aside and instead think about what's going to produce the best results? And the more general message is that I don't think that science can give us more answers to moral questions by itself. But when we're dealing with these complex, uniquely modern moral problems, I don't think that we can do well without science. That we need a scientific understanding of the quirks in our own moral judgment and decision making in order to make better judgments. So many thanks to all of the people and institutions who made this possible, and thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you, Josh. We have some time for questions. I'll let you field your own questions. If you could repeat the question for the video.
Sure. Okay.
Mine can be quick. Can you just summarize again what are the effects of humor, depletion, and cognitive load directionally on judgment? So I'm guessing these things should decrease.
So cognitive load. Yeah, so cognitive load interferes selectively with utilitarian judgment. I say interferes because it didn't actually change people's judgments. It just made the utilitarian judgments slower. The depletion experiment, it didn't slow people down, or didn't just slow people down. It actually changed their judgment. So cognitively depleting people made people interfered with utilitarian judgment and actually made people give lower utilitarian ratings. So they were less utilitarian. So those in the same direction, and the depletion experiment was more extensive. What was the other one you asked about? The humor. So the idea is that if it's a negative emotional response that makes you say, no, don't push the guy off the footbridge, then if you counter that with some positive emotion, then people will be more utilitarian. And that's what they found. And that's similar to the visual interference study that I described. That is, you disrupt people's visual imagery by making them do a visual task, and they become more utilitarian. Because you're either disrupting the imagery that would trigger the negative response in one case. In the other case, the idea is that the positive, funny ha-ha is overriding or interfering with the negative response that makes you go, oof, don't push. Yeah. Jeff?
So I've got a question about what you were calling the direct route by which science can inform normative judgment.
Yeah.
And so it sort of seems like the questions you were posing, do people make good moral judgments?
Yeah.
Have a descriptive component as well as a normative component. And
right.
It seems to me just that the science is answering the descriptive component, what sorts of moral judgments do people make?
Right.
But it's still utterly silent on whether they are good moral judgments to make. And it really has would be silent on sort of basic moral questions like, is incest wrong?
Right. So that's, with adding a few things, that's exactly the point. So the classic philosophical worry is, so the question was, the more general question, I think Jeff was observing that The science tells you just how do people make judgments, what kinds of judgments do people make, what are people's judgments sensitive to. But it doesn't tell us anything about whether or not they ought to be that way. And that's right. And that was what I was trying to illustrate with that, first with the case of capital juries, and then applying it to the dilemmas cases. So the idea is, yes, you're absolutely right. You can't make any moral progress here without adding an additional ought. And that ought is not supported by the science. So take the case of the children on the other side of the world. We say, do people make good judgments about this? Well, that's a moral question. That's an ought question. And then we say, what are people's judgments sensitive to? And the science says people's judgments are sensitive to mere spatial distance, at least sometimes. And then we have to go beyond the science, and we have to ask ourselves, is mere spatial distance something that we ought to take into account? The fact that someone is n miles away instead of n minus whatever miles away, that should tell us whether or not we ought to save their lives. And if our answer to that is no, and that's not a scientific answer, that's a moral, just based on your moral values, then putting the science together with that question moves you forward and says, okay, there's something wrong with our judgments about these cases. So that's exactly right, that the science doesn't by itself give you the answer. But the science allows you to trade in a more difficult question, are we making good judgments in these cases, for an easier question, ought our judgments be sensitive to mere spatial distance? And it does that by showing scientifically, empirically, that mere spatial distance is a factor, right? Is an effective factor, right? So the science can do work, so to speak, in a moral argument, even if it doesn't do all the work. And that was the point. Yes.
I've got some questions about the phenomenology you're attributing to your research subjects at various points. One was the $2 versus $4 delay paradigm. But I guess the most important one to focus on is the utilitarian issue.
Yeah.
How do you know there aren't at least some of your respondents up in Cambridge there who have perfectly utilitarian grounds for objecting to pushing someone off the footbridge?
I'm trying to head this off, but it always comes back. That is, for example, it won't really work if you push the guy off the footbridge, or
precedent setting.
It's sorry, Phil. I didn't recognize you at first. Hi. We tell people to assume that there are no further consequences here, and some people may accept that, some people may not. My guess is that, well, one piece of evidence. So if you just looked at the behavioral data, I think that would be that would be a difficult alternative explanation to fully overcome. But when you look at the dual process story, I think it's harder to maintain that story. So let's take the patients with the ventromedial prefrontal damage. If what's making ordinary people say no is that they're making some kind of rational consequentialist calculation about what's likely to produce better consequences in the long term, then there's no reason to think that damaging the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is going to push them more in that direction, right? And there's no reason why your amygdala should be more active when you, and why amygdala activity should track making the more deontological judgment. So we've tried to do as much as we could to, with the behavioral experiments, control for the possibility that people could be having consequentialist reasons for doing this. But I think that the extent that we've done that, plus all of the dual process evidence, speaks against that. But
well, I guess this might be a John Knight negative heuristic here, but you can imagine a response about a condensed consequentialism. I just don't want to live in a society in which people feel that they can make judgment calls like that.
Right. So the explanation for the ventromedial prefrontal patients would be that as a result of having the emotional damage, they are more comfortable with living in such a society? Is that the thought? Right. So I think maybe even the strongest argument against this would be the cognitive reflection test priming. So that is, we put people in this mindset, at least this is what we think we're doing, that says don't trust your intuitions. And then they end up being more utilitarian. I don't know. I mean, that's pretty targeted evidence that it's an intuitive response pushing one way and a counterintuitive response pushing the other way. So I'm all out of ammo after that. But that's it. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so trying to bridge what you described as the gap between what is and what ought to be, I'm reminded of a piece by Paul Bloom where he proposes that different sets of moralities apply to different sets of people. So if we're to really entertain that proposal, then are we really gaining a good understanding of what is?
So I'm not sure I understood the question.
So different sets of moralities, different sets of people. So
meaning
family,
like in-group versus out-group?
family versus
family
friends
right.
versus strangers, such as those that
Right.
are often featured in the footbridge.
Right. So in most of the dilemmas that I've talked about, it's always about strangers, right? There is one study actually that I sort of glossed over, looking at the ventromedial prefrontal patients, looking at kin relationships. So basically, the study is: will you turn the trolley on your sister in order to save 5 people? Most people say no. The ventromedial prefrontal patients are much more likely to say yes. So if you, I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but this framework can account for, I think, automatic emotional responses that speak specifically to certain categories of people. But maybe that doesn't answer your question.
Sure, I could.
Maybe we should talk after. Okay, thanks. Yes.
There are some other philosophical and theological arguments that might go against the decisions you're making about morality that Karl Barth looked at liberal Protestant thinking
Yeah.
and thought that it led to the acceptability within Germany of the Holocaust. Heidegger's late thinking also said that because of the failure to look at the mystery of being and relying entirely on Cartesian dualism and the reason that goes with that, he thought that led ineluctably to moral relativism and again to Nazism. There's also an Islamic argument that if you, the devil works by getting you to think your way out of what has been commanded and rationalizing it rather than thinking it. How do you deal with that?
So, I'm not sorry that I'm being so obtuse with this question, but I'm not sure I understand the question. So what you described is very interesting. If I can sort of recapitulate what you said, is that there's at least some social theorists have argued that a certain kind of Protestant morality would allow people to sort of think their way out of their basic instincts that are ultimately necessary for a sane society, and that a society that loses that loses a sense of the sacredness of being or something like that.
The thinking can get you out of the sacred and ultimately into complete moral relevance.
And so
there's something about not pushing someone who is another human that's right next to you, that you see, you touch, you act directly upon. That is. I'm not going to defend this. Just raise it.
So I think the thought is that isn't there something? I mean, I think this is So I agree that I think that it's good that we are reluctant to push people off of footbridges, and I think John Stuart Mill would agree. The question is, what is the ultimate standard of right and wrong? And if you're someone like if you're someone like Kant, or someone who's more inclined to a kind of certainly not consequentialist and perhaps more, a moral system that's oriented towards sacred values, actually in the sense that Phil Tetlock has described. You can try to justify that in different ways. So what Mill would say is it's good that we have these deeply ingrained moral habits. Automatic settings, they're good most of the time. You don't want to get rid of them. Don't go lesioning people's amygdalas, right? For many reasons. But the reason why they're good is because in the long run, they get people to do the good things. And the ultimate measure of their goodness is a consequentialist one. Whereas someone like Kant might say that, no, these things are tapping into something more fundamental than costs and benefits. That the moral truth is not about producing good consequences. It's about some kind of deeper values. And that's a very compelling view. I think it's wrong. But I haven't defended that here. That's why I'm writing a whole book about this. But it's a counterintuitive view. I think that the Kantian and the orientation towards the sacred is more intuitively compelling. I mean, it's more compelling because it's more intuitive. And so I owe you and the rest of the world a better explanation than I just gave you for why we should think more like wonky economists, at least when it comes to public policy. So let me get someone from the way back. Way back.
To what extent do you see this research as an argument for strong moral paternalism?
Paternalism. In some cases, I would say that it is. I'm a fan of nudgy kinds of things. So for those of you who don't know, so the question was, is this an argument for certain kinds of paternalism? So the nudge concept is that there are ways in which relatively modest impositions on our freedom can produce such great benefits that it's worth restricting freedom in the name of the greater good. And one example of this is the opt-in versus opt-out organ donation systems that I mentioned. So to clarify this, in some countries, here in the U.S., the system is opt-in, which is that if you're going to be an organ donor, you have to actively sign up and say, yes, I want to be an organ donor. In other countries, in Europe primarily, but not everywhere in Europe, they have an opt-out system where you're assumed to be an organ donor, but if you can opt out. Everybody has the same freedom of choice, but in one case, the burden is on you to make this active effort if you don't want to be involved. And there's admittedly a greater risk that there will be mistakes. Someone who's assumed to be an organ donor might end up losing their organs after they're dead, we hope, when they didn't want to. But the idea is that having this somewhat more restrictive system can save so many lives every year that it's worth doing it. And I think that's a great utilitarian argument, and I'm all for that kind of nudgy paternalism. But if you're a real utilitarian, you want to be a smart paternalist. Telling everybody, I mean, so imagine helping the world's poor. Here would be a stupid kind of paternalism, where we force people to, instead of spending money on their children, we tax them heavily, and we tell them they have to send their money overseas to people who need the money more. So to each according to his or her need. I think as the human experiment with communism demonstrated, this is not a good fit with human psychology. And you have to take into account human psychology when you're deciding where you want to lay down your paternalistic hand. As E.O. Wilson said of communism, E.O. Wilson studies ants, great theory, wrong species. And so even as a utilitarian who's trying to promote the greater good, you have to be very careful and be very sure that your restrictions on freedom are going to produce the kind of consequences that you're hoping for.
Final question.
All right, final question. Yes.
You started to look at the individual neural differences because you have these really compelling charts about the differences between doctors and others.
Yeah.
Have you started to use confusion MRI to look at individual differences?
Oh, structural differences, you mean? I have not yet done anything with structural differences. So the question is, do people, if you just take a still image of somebody's brain, can you make some sort of estimate or guess about what their moral judgments are likely to be like? The psychopaths seem to have some anatomical differences, and they have some behavioral differences, and so if you put those two things together, you might think that there would be a correlation between their anatomy and their brain anatomy and their moral judgment. There's a recent study, kind of hard to believe, but showing that political orientation can be predicted by the size of the amygdala, and that certainly has moral dimensions to it. So, this may not be too far off, but my guess is that you're not going to be accounting for a lot of the variance in people's moral views and attitudes based on brain structure, but there may be something that, p less than 0.05. So.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.